Okay, so let's resume. Let's return to our alignment problem. So maybe in light of what we have just seen in terms of background on Erdős-Rényi graph, so now we can interpret the information theoretic feasibility result that I was mentioning, NPS of the order of log n. This is exactly the threshold for connectivity in the intersection graph in our model of two correlated graphs. And so we'll see that the properties of this intersection graph matter.
Chemical graph or protein graph? Can we assume that a protein graph or chemical graph is coming from some random?
You see, the Erdős-Rényi random graph is very stylized. It's nice for analysis, but indeed, if you want to model real-life graphs like protein-protein interaction graphs, it's likely not going to be a perfect match. But at least in terms of pushing the theory forward, that's where you want to start with the Erdős-Rényi.
Okay, thank you.
Then you want to add complexity, and so there are variations like allowing for a degree distribution that is more general, then building in some geometrical properties. So these extensions have been considered, but this gets harder typically. So for the theory, we typically start with Erdős-Rényi.
Thank you.
Okay, so right. So before I start stating results on yes. It's easy enough to see that if you have isolated vertices in the intersection graph, then you will not be able to figure out how to reconstruct sigma star on those isolated vertices. So that is easy enough. Yes. The other direction, that it suffices that there are no isolated vertices, is much harder. Okay, so I want first to show you a computation. So let me take two graphs, G1, G'2, two candidate graphs. Let's look at the number of edges, E1 in G1, E2 in G'2, E intersect in the corresponding intersection graph. Then you can work out the probability that you get in your sampling procedure, G1 and G'2. It's very easy because of all the independence built into the model. So you have PS to the power the number of double edges, P1 minus S to the power all the simple edges, which amounts to this exponent. And then you have the remaining probability, which is 1 minus this, to the power the remaining number of pairs of vertices on which you don't see any edges. So if you put things together, you find out that this probability of seeing two graphs, G1, G'2, is proportional to some quantity raised to the power the number of double edges, the number of edges in the intersection graph. So you can push this calculation a bit, and what you will see is that the probability that your unknown permutation sigma star is equal to a specific permutation sigma, having observed G1 and G2, is going to be proportional to this same quantity raised to the power the number of double edges in the intersection graph corresponding to intersecting G1 with G2 on which you change the labels according to sigma minus 1. So in other words, the posterior distribution of your unknown quantity only depends on the number of double edges you induce on the corresponding graphs when you apply this candidate permutation. And that's an important property. Okay, so now let's state an impossibility result when the product lambda S, which is the average degree in the intersection graph, is less than 1. That's something we did in 2021 with my then PhD student Luca Ganassali and my colleague Marc Lelarge. so the intersection graph we know is an Erdős-Rényi random graph with average degree lambda s. And so we know we are below the emergence of the giant component. So there's no giant component, but we know more. The structure of connected components of those graphs has been studied quite in detail. In particular, there is the textbook on random graphs by Béla Bolobás, which will tell you that most of the nodes in this subcritical Erdős-Rényi graph, they are in connected components that are small trees. So I've mentioned that if you take one vertex, you look at its neighborhood in a graph, then this is distributed like a branching process with a Galton-Watson branching process with a Poisson of spring with a average number of children lambda s, which is less than 1. So this dies out. And so most of the connected components, these are like Galton-Watson branching processes which die out. Okay, so we are going to use this in the following manner. So we start sampling a G-intersect. Then we look at, say, a particular shape of a tree in those connected components. And we would know by the result of Bolobás that there are order n many copies of this connected component in the intersection graph. So what we do, taking those copies, we cook up a permutation sigma that swaps the vertices of all those trees in such a way that it preserves the tree structure in the intersection graph. So here I've illustrated this on the picture. I have two small trees, and I could say take sigma, which sends I to j and j to I, and I prime to j prime and j prime to I prime. So when I apply this to, say, the edges of G2, I don't see the difference on those. I don't delete any double edges, and I don't. I preserve all the double edges in those small trees. Okay, so I could take a random permutation that swaps those small trees uniformly at random. It's going to preserve all the double edges in my G-intersect graph, but it's going also to change the labels of most of the vertices. So in other words, the overlap between my permutation sigma and the identity will be vanishing with high probability. So I'm going to use that in the following manner. I'm going to show that with some probability, my randomly constructed permutation will not create any additional double edges. So maybe I should draw a picture here. So I had, say, a tree like that, another one like that. Maybe I have another vertex and I have, these are edges in G1, edges in G2. When I swap those, okay, for G2, I will not kill this double edge, but I might create a new double edge here, okay? So I will replace this by this. So, but this happens with a small probability. And so what I can analyze is the average number of newly created double edges when I apply these random permutations. And this is going to be of order 1. And moreover, I can use those Poisson approximation techniques I was mentioning earlier and show that, in fact, the number of newly created double edges in my procedure has a Poisson distribution asymptotically. So the probability that I create no double edge is going to be order 1. And so my G-intersect, which was G1 intersected with G prime 2, is also G1 intersected with G prime 2, shuffled with this random permutation. So I can do that several times. And what I get is that I can produce a number of permutations, sigma 1 to sigma p. I can pick some number p fixed, arbitrarily fixed, such that the posterior distribution of my sigma star given G1, G2 is the same as the posterior distribution of sigma I composed with sigma star conditional at G1, G2. So in other words, I can do the following. I can start from the two graphs. I can construct permutation sigma 1 to sigma p with these probabilities, with these properties, sorry. And then nature decides whether the true permutation is either sigma star or sigma 1 composed with sigma star or sigma 2 composed with sigma star. It decides that. And the distribution of the corresponding observations will be correct. And so we could imagine the following game. Nature considers p+1 candidate permutations. It chooses one and it tells the statistician, look, the true permutation is one of those p+1 permutations. Pick whatever you prefer. And there is no way you can do better than guessing by chance. So you'll have an overlap that is going to be perfect, one with probability 1 over p. It's going to be zero negligible order with probability p minus 1 over p. So your expected overlap is going to be order 1 over p. And since p is arbitrary, then with a high probability, your overlap goes to 0. Okay, so this is an impossibility result that you can cook up with some involved arguments in showing the Poisson approximation. There's combinatorics involved in this part of the argument, but apart from that, it's not so involved. No, it's just positive. Yeah, it's just counting the number of vertices on which two permutations agree, and then you normalize by number of vertices. So it is. So when I write, it's positive on it, so which makes the argument work.
Several subgraphs which could more or less these trees which could more or less similar. So to sort of permute the vertices in both these.
Yes, you have several explanations for what was the alignment initially, and you cannot distinguish between them. They are statistically equivalent. So shuffling the trees. Yes. You want to shuffle trees which have exactly the same structure. But in those random graphs, you take a tree with 10 nodes, it's going to appear order n times in your random graph. So that's what makes things work. Okay, so quickly, yes?
This result is for any estimate.
Yes.
Instead of it, the posterior of this form. So, given closed form, I can sample from this,
So I guess what it says is that if you do the sampling of the posterior distribution of sigma star, we'll have with equal probability the true one and several fake ones which have vanishing overlaps, and you'll not be able to distinguish. No, there's no escape. Okay, so how does one go about showing the other direction? Because it happens to be tight, this condition on lambda s. So there's been a series of works establishing how tight that is. So we started off in 2020, and we had a condition that was suboptimal. We were asking lambda s to be larger than some large constant. Then colleagues Wu, Su, and Yu in 21 showed that constant C equals 4 can do. And then it took some more work the next year for Ding and Hu to show that C equals 1 was the right constant. So now we have one part of our chart, the phase diagram. We know that the curve lambda s equals 1 is the boundary for information theoretic feasibility of partial alignment above and impossibility below. Okay, so maybe a few words on, yes? It means that with high probability, I can construct an estimator that will agree on a sizable fraction of the vertices. So let's say 20% of the vertices will be correctly labeled. I think in the analysis, I'm not sure. In what we will see next, we will be able to identify the vertices in the polynomial time methods I'm going to describe. But for the information theoretic feasibility, I'm not so sure. Maybe in the work of Ding and Yu, that is the case. So this essentially boils down to clever uses of the first moment method or union bounds. So we would say that a candidate permutation sigma is good if when we apply sigma to relabel the vertices of graph 2, and now we count the number of double edges we have, so summing over candidate pairs of vertices ij of A1 ij is the adjacency in graph 1, A2 sigma minus 1i, sigma minus 1j is the adjacency of graph G2 after relabeling by sigma. So we say permutation is good if we obtain at least n times beta for some constant beta double edges. N beta over 2, sorry. Okay, and so what we want to show is that any good permutation must achieve a good overlap, and we do that using the first moment method. So we say that the probability that there exists a good permutation sigma that has a poor overlap below some constant gamma. This can be upper bounded by the sum of permutations, that should be sigma here. Sigma which have a poor overlap, less than gamma, times, the probability that this is good. This is a small thing, and this would show that with high probability, any good permutation must have overlap at least gamma. Okay, first moment method. And we know that there exists a good permutation because the true permutation is good. And so what we do, the algorithm is not very efficient. We go through all the permutations until one meets this condition, and then we are done. Okay. So then the catch is to get a good bound on probability that sigma is good. So I'm not going to get into this, but this is a painful Chernoff bounding arguments. So we got to the condition lambda is larger than C, but because we are not sharp enough, then Wu, Su, and Yu tightened the arguments. They got to C equals 4 using better techniques, but essentially the same structure. But this is as good as it gets with this argument. And then Ding and Hu, they came up with a variation of this idea that I'm describing now. So there is a notion of a density of a graph. This is the ratio of number of edges divided by number of vertices. And so it turns out that for Erdős-Rényi graphs with average degree lambda s larger than 1, nice work by Venkat Anantaram and Justin Salez in 2016 established the fact that the densest subgraph of an Erdős-Rényi graph has a density that is identified, that is larger than 1, and a size in number of vertices that is order n, with a prefactor C that is also identified. I think Venkat is one of the speakers this week. Okay, so Ding and Hu don't call a permutation good, they call it reasonable, but apart from that, this is the same argument. So they say sigma is reasonable if the corresponding intersection graph induced by sigma admits a subgraph with density order rho and comprising order Cn vertices. And then, okay, this is a different line of arguments that have better concentration of random variables they consider, but using this alternative route, they can show that indeed, with high probability, provided lambda s is larger than 1, any reasonable permutation must achieve non-vanishing overlap. So much for IT feasibility. So the question is settled now. So let's now look at computational feasibility. So Ding and Hu, they managed to get sufficient condition lambda s larger than 1. And a year before we were at 4, and 2 years before we were at some unspecified large constant. And we know that you can't improve the lambda is larger than 1 case by the other result. Okay, so now polynomial time algorithms. So I'll describe some algorithms we were able to analyze, which are based on a very simple idea. The idea is that we would match vertex I in G1 with vertex U in G2 if their neighborhoods are similar enough. Okay, so that's the idea. This is what we call local algorithms. And so a few words on how the neighborhoods look like in our R-Schrödinger graphs. So something I already mentioned, in one of the two R-Schrödinger graphs, the neighborhood of a vertex, this looks up to some depth, like a Galton-Watson branching process with Poisson of spring distribution with parameter lambda. And now if we take two nodes that are far apart, their neighborhoods, they would look like two independent Poisson branching processes. Whereas if we consider a match, a real match, then we get two correlated branching processes, okay? In particular, if we start in the union graph from some vertex I, then we see that its neighborhood will be, in fact, a branching process with three types of children. So children that are attached with a double edge. And so there would be Poisson of lambda S, such children. And then we have single colored children with a Poisson lambda 1 minus S a number for each single color. Okay. So this observation led us to relate our initial problem of aligning graphs with a problem of testing whether two branching processes are correlated or independent. So here's the formal test hypothesis testing problem that we end up considering. We consider a pair of labeled trees to depth D, TD and T prime D. And under the null hypothesis H naught, we assume that they are Galton-Watson branching trees with a Poisson of spring distribution, parameter lambda, and they are independent, crucially. So I'm going to denote by P lambda D this distribution. On the other hand, under the alternative hypothesis H1, they are correlated and they are constructed as follows. You start with a common branching process, which is Poisson with parameter lambda S. And to each of the vertices in the common subtree that is colored in orange on the picture, I attach extra children. So Poisson lambda 1 minus S blue children here, dangling from each orange node. And then from each of these new children, I attach dangling Poisson lambda branching process. Okay, so the correlation is through this colored orange common branching process. But then I shuffle the vertices. I don't show the colors. And the game is to decide whether this was a pair of independent trees or trees correlated in this manner. And so we have the following definition for this correlation detection problem. We say that we have one-sided detectability if there is a test that takes the two trees, TD, T prime D, that returns a hypothesis 0 or 1, such that if we are under the alternative hypothesis, so under distribution P lambda SD, probability that we detect correctly is lower bounded away from 0, whereas our probability of deciding we are under the null hypothesis when we are in the null hypothesis goes to 1. So in other words, the probability of making false alarms is going to 0. And so what we could show, I'm not going to give details on that, but we could show that if we have one-sided detectability according to this definition, then we can cook up an algorithm that is based on checking neighborhoods locally and deciding to match vertices if the neighborhoods are sufficiently alike. And the corresponding algorithm will enjoy the following properties, it gives you a partial matching. So it picks a subset of vertices in G1 and finds the correspondence in G2. And this subset has a size that is order n. And the number of mistakes you do in the matchings for this subset is order little o of n. So in other words, we find a non-vanishing overlap, but we know where the good matches are. So this is better, in fact, than just producing a permutation and saying, among these 20% are correct, but I won't tell you where. Here we also say where the correct matches are. Okay, so I'm going to tell you now a bit the kinds of results we could get on these tests. So we actually started off with Luca Ganasali in 2020 with a specific test, and this is what led us to generalize the notion of a test between the two trees. So our specific test was based on finding a subtree common to the two trees that had many leaves. So here I draw two trees. I draw in red a subtree that is common to the two trees, and that has 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 leaves. So we apply a threshold on the number of leaves of the common subtree, which has the largest number of such leaves. And this is the test we propose. And so this is our first result of the kind. We can show that for lambda close to 1, above 1, there is a range of values for S where we can get a test which has the properties I have described. And so in our phase diagram, we can carve a small green region where we know in polynomial time we are going to be able to align partially the graphs. So that was interesting because this was the first result where we could allow for S that was bounded away from 1. Prior to that, there were no such results. But okay, so that's good. But if you have a hypothesis testing problem, why go for a suboptimal test? We have a theory of hypothesis testing, which is quite rich and powerful. And we know what is the best test for hypothesis testing. There is this, yes? Yep. Yes.
So I'm a bit lost.
So this is based on checking neighborhoods, right? So we are looking at two vertices, one in each graph. We are looking at their neighborhoods in their respective graphs, not too far from the nodes. And so these neighborhoods are typically tree-like, those Erdos-Shreni graphs. So we don't get to see the giant component and whatnot. We stop early on. We take some reasonably large depths, but we don't go sufficiently fast so that we would see cycles. So we don't see the giant component. So it gets more dense, but the tree-like structure still holds so long as the average degree is order 1. So yeah, its local structure is a branching structure. So a tree structure up to some depth, the depth to which it holds that shrinks as the average degree increases, indeed, because it gets denser, more cycles appear, but this still holds so long as this is order 1. Yeah, so I'm looking at the maximum of trees that are common subtrees of both of my trees. I'm counting the number of leaves at the depth that I'm considering. So here this was depth 3, and I had a count of 7 leaves, and that's it. I'm applying a threshold. If this is above a threshold, then I decide it's the alternative hypothesis H1. Below, I decide it's H0. Yes, if it's large, then
number turns out to be large. Number of leaves are large.
Yes.
And then it means that they are not independent. They are very close.
Well, when they are very close to each other, then you could tell the whole tree. These would be isomorphic trees at the extreme. And so all the leaves would count. So that would be a large number. But okay, this goes only so far. I mean, we have a restricted set of parameters for which this test works. And we can do better, in fact. Yeah. This is not the last word on this testing problem. This is something we have not worked out yet. We believe that if we have a polytime alignment based on local algorithms, for a notion of local algorithms, then there would be that would be an equivalent thing, but this is not fully worked out yet. And the definition of what a local algorithm means is subject to debate. Yeah. So okay, so coming back to the hypothesis testing problem, the best test there is the Neyman-Pearson test. According to the Neyman-Pearson lemma, you should test based on the likelihood ratio of your two distributions. That does not get any better than that. So this likelihood ratio we can massage to some extent. We'll see. What we could show, in fact, that using this remark that indeed the best test is based on thresholding the likelihood ratio, that this one-sided detectability is equivalent to the fact that the Kullback-Leibler divergence between my two distributions, the correlated one and the non-correlated one, for given depth d, this goes to infinity as depth goes to infinity. So that's something we could work out. And so the game now is to say, okay, I'm going to use tests based on thresholding the likelihood ratio. These are going to be optimal. And these are going to lead to a polytime alignment, provided I have this condition. So the game is to understand when this condition holds. Okay, so it turns out that this likelihood ratio admits a recursive structure. And this is not very hard. This is actually, I would say, an exercise in branching process theory. You can work it out. So the likelihood ratio to depth d of two trees t prime, which are described as a collection of subtrees attached to the root, t1 to t capital D for the first, t prime 1 to t prime capital D prime for the second. This is a summation over the candidate number of common children between these two root nodes of the two trees. So k would have to range between 0 and the smallest of the number of children of the roots in the two trees, d inf d prime. So you have a pre-factor, and then you have a summation over injective maps from 1 to k to the children of the root in the first tree. Sigma prime is an injective map from 1 to k to the children of the root in the second tree. And then you get a product of likelihood ratios of the dangling trees from the roots corresponding to the injective maps sigma prime. So it's a mouthful. It's not very nice to parse, but it's explicit. And so it gives you, so you can work around it. And for instance, under the alternative hypothesis H1, you can lower bound this by saying, okay, I'm going to consider the true matches that correspond to this orange common subtree. And this will give me a lower bound, and then this gives me an easy, sufficient condition on which to work to show that this likelihood ratio must grow fast, and so the KL divergence must diverge. So this is the first result we got. Don't try to parse this. This does not help. But this sufficient condition, this tells us, well, at least in the vicinity of lambda equals 1, the boundary for polytime alignment is exactly lambda s equals 1. So we have increased our green area thanks to this simple reason. So at that point, we did not know how to push this analysis. That's when we started working with a very bright guy, Guilhem Semerjian from ENS in the physics department, who told us, well, I think I know of an approach where we could do better than that. And so this is what I want to tell you last about this problem. That's work from last year with Guilhem Semerjian, this guy from theoretical physics, and Luca Ganasali again. The approach we took was to try and determine asymptotics for the scale divergence that we want to understand when the average degree lambda becomes large. And the philosophy, if you like, of the approach is to somehow come up with Gaussian limiting distributions for our branching processes for which computation of KL divergences would be feasible. Okay. For depth 1, that's something you can do right away. Okay. For depth 1, a tree of depth 1, this is very simple. This is just an integer. This is the number of children. So if we have a Poisson random variable d number of children of the root, which has a mean lambda, then if we subtract lambda and divide by square root lambda by the central limit theorem, then this is going to converge to a standard Gaussian random variable. In the uncorrelated case, those transforms of the two trees to depth 1, this will converge to a two-dimensional standard Gaussian. And in the correlated case, you have a 2D Gaussian, but you have a correlation that appears off the diagonal of the covariance matrix. And doing a little bit more work, we can figure out that the KL divergence to depth 1 must converge to the KL divergence between these two distributions. And so we get a formula. Okay, so far so good. But then the difficulty is to do something of this kind for arbitrary depth. Okay. So it turns out that so far I've not pressed that point, but I was implicitly dealing with trees with labels, meaning that the children of the root would be labeled from 1 to D. I would order them. And this is not the best way to represent the objects we are dealing with. It's actually more convenient to deal with unlabeled trees. So the objects we're actually going to consider from now on is unlabeled rooted trees. In other words, we would deem these two things the same object because these are up to reordering of the vertices. This is the same tree. Okay. So more formally, let's call XD the collection of rooted unlabeled tree of depth at most D. And there's a very convenient way of representing an element of a set XD as a counting measure so it's for each such tree of depth at most D-1, we count how many copies of that tree tau there is as a subtree root that is rooted at a child of the root. Okay. Is that clear? The recursive description. Okay, so we have a way of representing trees. And so going back to our idea of identifying Gaussian limits. So for a depth D Galton-Watson tree with Poisson offspring, then we look at its representation by having the counts of occurrences of specific subtrees attached to the root. We know that in the Galton-Watson process, those counts are independent, and the count attached to subtree tau has a distribution that is Poisson of lambda times the probability under this Galton-Watson distribution with parameter lambda and D-1 of seeing that tree tau. So there's an explicit, if you like, description, which is not the classical one, but it's actually more convenient. So you could consider the rescale quantities after centering, and you might hope that this converges to some Gaussian limit as lambda goes to infinity. The catch is that for a fixed tree tau, this will go to 0. And so this is not a straightforward description to process. So let's do something more to get to our central limit theorem. So I want now to introduce another representation of our two correlated trees that turns out to be helpful for our purpose. So we can consider a Markov process in continuous time, which takes values in the space of our rooted unlabeled trees of depth at most d. And it evolves as follows. At each edge is cut at rate 1 over time. So in other words, to each edge, there is a timer attached, which has an exponential distribution with parameter 1. When this timer elapses, you cut the edge and you forget about the dangling subtree. And on the other hand, for a tree that is at depth h, at rate lambda, you will graft so by this I mean, okay, this is my root. And then at some rate lambda, I will graft a subtree, which is going to have a distribution that is that of a Galton-Watson branching process with parameter lambda for the Poisson of string, and the depth is just the right depth to meet the depth constraint of D. And so this is a natural enough process, and it turns out that it is a process which is reversible, which has a stationary distribution, that's the Galton-Watson distribution. And in fact, the correlated distribution for our two trees corresponds to the joint law of this process at time 0 and at time minus log s. So this is something you can figure out. Okay, so why does that help us for pushing our program? Well, it turns out that we can analyze to a large extent this Markov process. It has an associated infinitesimal generator, and we can do a spectral decomposition of this infinitesimal generator. Let me go over that quickly. So in a nutshell, we can rewrite, once we have done this spectral decomposition of the generator, we can write down our probability under the correlated distribution of seeing two trees, x and y, as the probability under the uncorrelated model, times the summation over eigenelements in an eigenvalue eigenvector decomposition of our generators of these quantities. So S to the A beta is the correlation parameter S raised to minus an eigenvalue of the infinitesimal generator. So we have S appearing here, and then we have products of evaluations of two eigenvectors indexed by some beta at the entries X and Y, okay? And so we have a separation of S here and lambda there because the eigenvectors, they do not depend on S at all. So the interesting thing is that we can actually describe this in much detail, and we will be able to leverage this spectral decomposition in order to get central limit theorems that we are looking for. Okay, so depth d equals 1. That's what it looks like. So the spectrum, the opposite of the spectrum of the generator turns out to coincide with the non-negative integers. So these are the minus the eigenvalues of the infinitesimal generator, okay? And we find that the eigenvectors associated with eigenvalue m, these turn out to be what is known as the Charlier polynomials of degree m. And Charlier polynomials are a well-studied family of orthogonal polynomials. They are orthogonal, in fact, for the Poisson lambda probability distribution. So, okay, we have this description, and what is quite surprising is that we can push to any depth this kind of description. And there is, in fact, a very natural indexing of the eigenelements in this diagonalization. It turns out, so this diagonalization is done by induction on D, and it turns out that the natural thing to do is to index the eigenelements by rooted unlabeled trees of depth D, and this is what we call dual trees because they don't have a meaning that we can lay out, but this is the natural indexing. The negative eigenvalue of the generator turns out to be the size of the tree measured in number of vertices, okay? And we have a recursive construction of eigenvectors, which turn out to be a family of orthogonal polynomials for the Galton-Watson branching process measure. So this is not what we set out to find. What we set out to find was a central limit theorem, but these eigenvectors allow us to get a nice central limit theorem, which is as follows. So starting from our trees, T described by tree counts n tau for trees of depth less than the original one. So we consider the centered and rescaled counts, and we take the scalar product of these centered rescaled counts with the corresponding eigenvector, and this gives us a corresponding scalar indexed by beta, the corresponding dual tree. And so what we have is the following asymptotic Gaussianity result, which says that if we describe our original trees T and T prime thanks to this transform, which turns out to be a one-to-one transform, this is a bijective transform, and now the distribution of those beta indexed value scalars for each of the two trees, T prime under the correlated model, these converge as lambda goes to infinity to a multidimensional Gaussian. And so if you take distinct values of beta, you'll have independent Gaussians. And for the same value of beta, you find a two-dimensional correlated Gaussian with correlation coefficient being s to the power the number of vertices in this dual tree. So now we are in good shape to conclude with some results. And I think I cannot do justice to this, diagonalization and asymptotic Gaussianity. This takes several pages of painful calculations. This is done by induction, let's say, and I'll leave it at that. But now we can really work out what is the behavior of the KL divergence somehow. So to express things, I'm going to introduce some combinatorial quantities. First, AN will be the number of unlabeled rooted trees with n vertices, whereas ADN is going to be the number of unlabeled rooted vertices with rooted trees with n vertices and depth at most d. And so what we can get from the previous Gaussian convergence result is that the KL divergence, as lambda goes to infinity, converges to half log of a summation over positive integers n of this number of trees ADN times s to the power twice n minus 1. Now it turns out that the counting of rooted unlabeled trees has been studied in detail in 1948 by a guy named Otter. And he showed that AN behaves like n to the minus 3/2 times alpha to the minus n, where alpha is now known as Otter's constant, and it's approximately 0.33. And so we know that as we increase the depth here, ADN will increase to AN, And so if S squared is larger than alpha, then this blows up. If it's strictly larger than alpha, this blows up, this series will diverge. Whereas if S squared is less than or equal to alpha, this converges. So this gives us our dichotomy. If S is smaller or equal to square root alpha, then this limiting KL divergence is finite. Whereas if S is strictly larger than root alpha, then this KL divergence blows up. So now that we have that, I'm nearly done. And I'll skip the combinatorial arguments, but they are nice. And you can check them in our paper with Guilhem and Luca. So now we can conclude. We can conclude as follows. If the correlation parameter S is smaller than or equal to square root of the author's constant, alpha, then in polytime, using a local algorithm checking the similarity of neighborhoods, we'll be able to partially align our graphs. No, if it's less, we will fail. Okay, so our algorithm fails if we are below this square root alpha line, sorry. If we are strictly above this line, then for lambda sufficiently large but finite, we will succeed with our local scheme. And so our understanding now is this two-colored graph. And we know that our scheme fails below that. We don't know exactly how this line approaches square root alpha, but at least we have some understanding of feasibility with local algorithms. So I want to conclude with a number of open questions and remarks. So first off, okay, we understand the phase diagram for feasibility, information theoretically speaking. Polytime feasibility with local algorithms of the kind we have been considering, okay, so that's done, but the story is not over. It could well be that there are polytime alignment strategies that succeed even below this square root alpha line. In fact, on the 1st of June, the same Jen Ding that I already mentioned, who's a very sharp guy, put on archive a paper where he succeeds at doing in polytime full alignment of two correlated Erdős-Rényi graphs for S, a correlation parameter that is anything fixed. So it could be less than this square root alpha in particular, but for average degree that blows up like n to some fixed power. So n to the 1/10, say. So for a while, when I was working on these local algorithms, I thought that feasibility of local algorithms would entail feasibility, would be equivalent to feasibility of any polytime algorithm. But I was not so sure, and I'm less and less sure, especially in view of the very recent results of Jen Ding. So it's quite open whether there is a gap. Well, it's called a hard phase, a gap between IT feasibility threshold and polytime feasibility threshold. There seems to be a gap, but we don't quite know. So finding an algorithm that would succeed in polytime for lambda order 1, but below the S equals square root alpha, that's a big challenge. We don't know how to do that yet. There are also many directions about finding better algorithms, because our polytime algorithm, okay, we can prove something for it, but it's a bit cumbersome. You don't really want to use this one. So it's mostly developed for theoretical purposes. So we'd want some faster algorithms that enjoy theoretical guarantees, okay? And I guess a good starting point would be to take known convex relaxations that have been proposed in the literature to align graphs, and for which there is absolutely no guarantee in terms of recovering some hidden permutation in this correlated Erdős-Rényi setup. Okay, so I've already talked about whether there is a hard phase or not between the computational and information theoretic thresholds. We would also want to know to what extent this hard phase, if it exists, is hard. And so the typical approaches people have used to show that indeed in some parameter range, a problem is hard to solve. There are several approaches. There is a so-called sum of squares hierarchy. So you cast your problem as a combinatorial optimization problem for which you describe convex relaxations of higher and higher dimensions. And you show that you fail at any finite level of this hierarchy. So that's one approach, the sum of square hierarchy approach. There's an overlap gap property approach that's been developed a lot by David Gamarnik at MIT. That is a way to show that a family of algorithms, maybe Monte Carlo methods, will fail. Low degree polynomial methods is yet another approach to show hardness. So this is wide open. There's nothing at this stage for this problem. And then, okay, I've been talking about aligning two Erdős-Rényi graphs. This is the simplest and the most stylized version of the problem, but there are many variants. So you could take other graph models, which would make life harder, but maybe would be closer to some applications. You may align more than two graphs. That makes sense in many applications. So if you have protein-protein interaction graphs in several species, then you could align other metric structures, point clouds. Okay, so this is a rich field of investigation. It's by no means a done thing. Okay.
Thank you, Laurent. Do we have more questions pertaining to these lectures? Yes.
Naively match graphs. I would just look at a node which have the highest number of edges and stick it and check if they're matching each other, and then I'll go around the rest. Is that being implemented somewhere?
Actually, the way the Shmatikov and Narayanan algorithms were developed, to address the Netflix data price de-anonymization. I think they were starting from matches. So they knew some identities were revealed. So they had some correspondences. And then they would say, two nodes I am going to match if among their neighbors there are many matches that I know that are correct. So that's one approach that was a bit of a bootstrap approach. You would propagate matchings. So this is not exactly what you say, but it is close. But there's some of the early work for, maybe I'll just go back to the slide. All right, so I think Ding et al. In 2018, their algorithm would start matching very high degree nodes together and then propagate from there on. So it's bootstrapping. To bootstrap the strategy, you indeed match high degree nodes together. So that works for these Erdős-Rényi models if you have a large enough degree. So you need degree that diverges. It will fail, I think, if you have an average degree of order 1.
There is a question in the back here.
So I wanted to ask two questions. The first is the graph alignment problem interesting when the average degree is bigger than O of 1? That is the first question. And the second question is, has the graph alignment problem in the context of random geometric graphs been studied?
So I think it's indeed interesting when average degree is not order 1. It calls for very different mathematical techniques. So here what I've described built a lot on the local structures. So this is no longer what you can do. You get, in a sense, random matrix theory would be a relevant tool. So the mathematical techniques would be very different, but still it's interesting. But it's better understood. A sparse case is harder in a sense. For random geometric graphs, I've been discussing with Jiaming Su, who is also one of the persons very active in this area. I don't think he has anything out yet, but he's been thinking about it. So you can check the papers by Jiaming Su from Duke University. But I think he's got nothing yet. But that's of interest to some people, definitely.
Maybe we'll take one last question before the pause.
If you want to apply techniques like these to say things like point cloud matching, then the number of points in the two clouds can be very different, and there can also be wild outliers. Right? So does this require the two graphs to be like completely isomorphic and you're determining only a partial set of correspondences, or
Actually, no. So what I've described was for the same number of vertices on both sides, but you don't need that at all. Okay. Actually, we could extend that for cases where you downsample vertices as well as edges. Okay. And so you get two correlated graphs, but they don't have the same number of vertices. And so the local approaches, they can be used on those cases. There's no reason why not to compare local neighborhoods. The global size does not matter there.
And it will be outlier resistant also.
The outliers, so that for what I've described would be robust to outliers, I think. Yes. But point clouds is a different topic. So again, Jiaming has a nice paper on aligning point clouds. Okay. So it's a Euclidean metric structure that you're trying to align. But I think it's still the early days, so there's more work to be done. Theory is still young.
Thank you very much. So we will resume at 11:50. Thank you, Laurent, again.